Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
For the second day running, Russian warplanes have used an Iranian airbase to launch attacks on Syria. While the strikes are said to be aimed at positions held by Islamic State militants, there is growing concern in the West over Moscow's activities on behalf of the Assad regime. The regime has carried out 200 airstrikes in the last 24 hours on the besieged city of Aleppo, where more than 250,000 people remain trapped, deprived of food, water and medical care. Tonight we have new pictures from inside the city, filmed by Waad al-Khatib. And a warning, my report does contain some very distressing images right from the start. The ER in Aleppo's Al-Quds hospital is a hive of human resilience. They were busy last night. Dr. Hamza tells his nurses to bandage one patient so they can get to work on another. More than 200 airstrikes yesterday from Syrian government and Russian forces. The worst day for a month. Amongst other things, they bombed the market. The plan is to make life too unbearable for civilians to stay here. It isn't working. More than 250,000 still survive in this hell. This bread seller clutches the only thing that remains from his stall. حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل الله ينتقم منهم حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل هي اشلاء كلها اشلاءهم بالاراضي 60 people died yesterday. 2-year-old Aysel wasn't one of them. Her uncle brought her in. His eyes are tired with a routine of trauma. Aysel's are wide with shock and incomprehension. She only cries when they clean up her wounds. She escaped with no serious injuries, but one of her white socks is washed red with her own blood. Her favorite glittery shoes have survived the war, so far. Dr. Hamza looks exhausted. He's been working here for almost 4 years, and it keeps getting worse.
سواء القصف على أحياء المدنيين أو استعمال القنابل العنقودية أو اليوم القصف اللي صار على الطريق الوحيد لإخلاء مدينة حلب وإغلاقه بالسيارات المتفحمة حاليا طريق مسكر بحيث إنه نحن ما بنقدر نحول أي مريض. هذا هو الوضع الإنساني حاليا موجود في المدينة.
Take me off the bed, the boy says, impatient to go. But where? Nowhere is safe in Aleppo. Back at home, Aysel is cleaned up and reunited with her father. He explains just how lucky she was. He picks up the remnants of what looks like a cluster bomb, like a toy cast aside. Above the clouds, above Syria, it's a pristine world, brought to you courtesy of the Russian Defense Ministry. The Tupolev bomber disgorging its deadly load. For a second day now, the Russians are flying from the Hamadan base inside neighboring Iran, much closer than the bases on the Caspian Sea. It signals another stage of Moscow's involvement. The Russians say they're bombing terrorist targets. But the lines between Russian forces and the Syrian government have become blurred. She can't distinguish, and nor can the rest of the world. So with airstrikes intensifying in Aleppo and the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in charge here while the Prime Minister is on holiday, we wondered if Britain was reassessing its policy on Syria, especially in the light of reports that Mr. Johnson wanted to normalise the UK's relationship with Moscow. So we asked to speak to the Foreign Secretary, or indeed any minister from the Foreign Office, to find out just where British policy is. No one was available. Foreign Office has denied any suggestion of a change or normalisation of relations with Russia and says it continues to challenge Moscow on a range of issues from Syria to Ukraine. Well, joining me now is, from the New Forest, is Desmond Swayne, who was, until last month, a minister in the Department for International Development. Thanks for coming on the programme. Normalising relations with Russia, good idea or bad idea?
Well, I think it's always a good thing to continually reassess your relationships and approaches to a problem. But Russia only understands strength. And as the Foreign Office press release said, we continue to challenge the Russians across a whole range of policies throughout the world. They are the troublemakers. They have perpetuated this war. It was almost...
Is the language strong enough? I mean, to challenge, is that a strong enough word under the circumstances?
Well, I'm not sure what more you can do. The reality is that we drew a line in the sand and we defined that line as being the use of chemical weapons. And when Assad crossed it, we did nothing. And if I'm fair, I think that there was no appetite on behalf of the British people to do anything. And so Parliament voted to do nothing. I think, therefore, all we can do is continue with the twofold approach that we have. One, attempting to get the combatants to the negotiating table, and two, providing a huge amount of relief within Syria, some £600 million so far.
But let's face it, I mean, this is an appalling tragedy that's been unfolding for years now, and we have been relegated to the position of ringside observers in this.
I'm afraid that assessment is absolutely accurate. The reality is that there won't be peace so long as at least one of the combatants believes that they can still win on the battlefield. And that is the case since Russia came in on the side so forcibly on Assad's behalf. Up till then, there was a measure of negotiation proceeding on the basis of the exhaustion of both sides and the belief that actually they couldn't win. Now they believe they can.
So the policy of the British government towards Syria at the moment is, and indeed Moscow, in Syria, is one of inertia.
Well, it's one of making representations at the highest level, whatever that might mean. But what is the alternative? Are you suggesting that we take military action? My belief was that there was an appropriate time for military action, and that was when Assad crossed the threshold and used chemical weapons against his own people. But having decided not to do that then, it's very difficult now to up the game and intervene militarily.
Should the UN be doing more?
That's one option. Well, the problem with the UN is that UN Security Council requires, of course, the assent and consent of Russia. And Russia is effectively one of the combatants.
So is it effectively, is the reality that we really just want one side or the other to win in this conflict, and we actually don't care whether it's Assad or indeed the rebels? We just want clarity, we want the battlefield to have some sort of coherence to it, and let the bleeding stop.
Well, letting the bleeding stop clearly has to be the absolute priority. To be perfectly frank, I don't think either side represents a particularly palatable winner. And that's why a negotiated solution is something that we must, whatever all the odds, whatever all the difficulties are, continue to pursue, whilst at the same time doing what we are doing effectively, and that is providing relief for those people who are suffering this misery.
Just a quick question finally about another conflict nearby in Yemen. Yesterday, a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital was hit. 12 people died in that attack. We know that British-sold weapons have been used by the Saudis in Yemen. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction is that is terrible, because it's not the first time the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital has been hit, and we were assured that it wouldn't happen again. I'd say the key difference between Syria and our involvement in support of the war aims of the coalition in Yemen, which is to restore the legitimate government of Yemen, the difference is, one, we're not combatants, and two, our main effort in Yemen is to get the combatants to the negotiating table, as well as providing a huge amount of relief.
But hang on a minute, we're selling arms that are killing civilians. That's just unethical, isn't it?
Well, we have a long-standing set of arms sales with the government of Saudi Arabia. If I believed that turning off the arms sales to Saudi Arabia would solve the problem in Yemen, I'd be shouting for it now. But I just don't believe that that's the case.
That's the kind of argument you hear from arms dealers sometimes.
Well, I'm not an arms dealer and I'm not involved with the arms sales, mercifully. What I will say is that this is subject to a due process in this country, and there is a judicial review on the question of our arms sales proceeding as now. But as for an urgency, I just don't believe withdrawing our arms sales from the Saudis would solve this problem. There's a war going on in Yemen because the legitimate government of Yemen was removed by force.
OK, Desmond Swain, thank you very much indeed. And later in the programme, we'll be looking at the refugee crisis that's been spawned by Syria and talking to a novelist about her take on events. Now back to tonight's main news, the continuing agonies of Syria's civil war. It was, of course, the spark that lit the touch paper to the refugee crisis, which itself has spawned endless political debate and news coverage. But now it has found its way onto the pages of a novel written by the Lebanese-Australian author Nada Anwar Jara. An Unsafe Haven tells the story of Hannah and her husband, a chance encounter with a Syrian refugee in Beirut and their efforts to reunite a family. We'll talk to the author in a moment. But first, let's look at the scale of the problem that millions still face. For over 5 years now, the bombs have fallen, driving millions from their homes in search of anything that isn't this. Syrians made up almost half of the refugees and migrants who reached Europe in 2015. In total, more than 1.3 million people made the journey, mostly crossing the Mediterranean to reach Greece and Italy. Almost 4,000 people died in their attempts. This year, more than 278,000 refugees and migrants have already arrived on Europe's shores, while more than 3,200 have died or are missing. But millions more remain closer to home, trying to eke out a life in neighbouring countries. The most stark example is in Lebanon, itself a survivor of a brutal civil war, and where Jara's story takes place, and where today more than 1 in 5 people are a refugee. Well, Nada Anwar Jara, the author of An Unsafe Haven, joins me now. Thanks for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
We talk a lot about Syria, obviously, we talk about Iraq, but we don't talk about Lebanon very much. And Lebanon has been changed, perhaps beyond recognition, by this crisis, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Lebanon is a small country of just over 4 million people, and we now have over 1 million Syrian refugees. And these are people from rural areas, very desperate. We don't allow them to set up official camps, so they're in encampments. They're getting very little aid, and because there's very little attention being paid to what's going on in Lebanon.
Have you spent time in the camps yourself?
Yes, I have. I've visited camps all over the country. And of course, they're a lot better off than, you know, the people you had at the beginning of the show in Aleppo. But at the same time, they are not allowed to work. They are required to pay for visas, which of course they cannot afford. They have to pay rent to landlords who are now taking advantage of them. And really, because they've been around for a long time, the Lebanese are suffering from compassion fatigue. So they're not getting the sort of welcome that they should have.
So when you hear the French government or French population also complaining about possibly thousands of Syrian refugees arriving in France, in this country we haven't been terribly generous either. Germany has been, but it's also a political problem. What's your reaction to the parsimonious attitude with which Europe has approached this problem?
Well, I think people should come over to Lebanon, see what it's like to have, you know, we're, as I said, a small country. Our infrastructure can hardly cope with the Lebanese. We have an incompetent government. And so these people are in really a desperate situation. And I think, you know, European countries should be, and the West in general, should be more
But will this
welcoming.
destabilize Lebanon? You know, Lebanon had a terrible civil war in the 1980s. Could this bring the country back to a situation of
Well, I think what it's
conflict?
done now, and this is that it's put Lebanon in a very uncertain situation. This is one of the reasons why we named the book An Unsafe Haven, because while Lebanon is a haven of sorts for them, it's also unsafe in that, you know, things are not secure. We don't know what might happen next. We have ISIS, you know, on one border, and we have now the Palestinian camps that are under, that ISIS is trying to infiltrate. So we don't know what's going to happen next.
And very briefly, this is a very personal story for you, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, just like many Lebanese, I feel absolutely devastated at what's going on. And I wish we could do more to help the Syrian refugees in Lebanon.
Nada Al-Majara, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.